we're going to have a little discussion here before the main event, and we're going to ask people, you with your devices, to vote on the questions that we're discussing. We're going to have a little conversation, and then we're going to see whether your views agree with what we're hearing up here. So, first I'll introduce I think this is a great panel to be some of my most admired people in Ottawa on stage here with me. We have to my immediate left, Sarah Goldfeder, principal with Earnscliffe Strategy Group, Nik Nanos, chairman of Nanos Research, and Amy Karam, president of Karam Consulting. All of these folks have lots to say about trade and the issues that are sort of currently on the agenda. So the way we're going to do it, though, is one question discussed among here. You'll vote on it, then we'll come back and another question. We're hoping to get through 3 or 4 before we have to stop. All right, so Nik, we're going to start with you. Is Canada, and here's a question for all of you, is Canada prepared for trade uncertainty within North America?
So yeah, I would say that I'll speak to Canadians as the pollster. I believe that Canadians are prepared. Why? 2 reasons. First of all, we have to think of 2 things being put together. First of all, live reality television in terms of the Trump administration. And second, I'll call it the zombie policy apocalypse, these 2 different factors that are happening. And I think this is good. The reality is that when Canadians, and they are very interested in trade right now and tuned in, the last time they were interested in trade was in the 1980s under Brian Mulroney. That was an exceptionally important part of Canada's future. And it might have been controversial, but Canadians were tuned into trade. They had a dialogue and debate about trade. They talked about Canada's future and had competing visions, and we got the free trade agreement and then eventually the North American free trade agreement. Fast forward now, and whether you love him or hate him, the fact that Donald Trump tweets and engages on trade in Canada actually puts it on the radar of Canadians as something to talk about at the water cooler. And I would say that's a good thing. Second of all, we have, I'll call the zombie policy apocalypse. It's kind of like The Walking Dead. The thing is this is a bit like a relationship. So think of Canada being a relationship and our partner saying, you know what, I'm not sure if this is working for me. What does that make us do? That makes us re-examine our relationship. It makes us examine our role, not just in terms of our partner, but around the world. And, when you roll up kind of this uncertainty, right, in terms of what's happening, I would say that Canadians are prepared, and they're prepared because they're talking about it. And I think it's important for us to continue to talk about trade, and not just our trade with the United States, but our trade around the world. And I think it can only be a good thing, even with all these crazy things that are happening.
Okay, points for zombie mention in before breakfast. Amy, your thoughts on this?
I'm going to slightly disagree with Nik in that I really don't think that we're ready. And the reason is 75% of our exports are to the US. What worries me is we don't have a diversification strategy, an export diversification strategy. And as many of you know, right, your financial advisors will always say diversify, diversify. And what happened to the Nortel folks who put a whole bunch of their stock in, their retirement fund into Nortel stock. So that's the aspect that worries me, and we're just too comfortable. We've become a little bit too complacent. It's been easy selling next door. And I've talked to some entrepreneurs, some small, medium enterprises, and they're like, no, I really haven't thought about going abroad. I have no idea where to start, where the opportunities are. So I'm good with the US market. So in that respect, I think we need to do an aggressive shift. And that's the aspect of why I think we're really not ready yet.
Sarah, where are you on this one?
Well, I think it's important to remember that governments aren't the ones that are engaged in trade. Businesses are engaged in trade. And I think at the end of the day, what you're going to find, regardless of whether or not there are trade agreements in place, businesses will find some place to sell their products. And it's like, water around rocks in a stream. There may be obstacles, there may be challenges, and businesses will look to government to help them with overcome those challenges. But I think at the end of the day, Canada is a trading nation, and nobody does that better in the world, really. And so when you look at what your financial prospects are, what your market prospects are, people want Canadian goods, and trade agreements or not in place. If Canadian businesses want to sell overseas, they will.
So I think what we have here is an interesting distinction, and I'm thinking we'll probably see this show up in the results too, is when we say Canada, are we talking about Canadian business? Are we talking about Canadian people? Or are we talking about the government? And the minister is here. So feel free to vote on that the way you like. And we are now seeing the poll results. And there's a slight, my fellow panelists here, I have the advantage. There is a slight advantage to yes. 53% say yes, 47% say no. Is Canada's progressive internationalism, that anybody who has been reading recent articles about this, Canada's progressive internationalism trade policy, helping or hurting our ability to negotiate new trade deals? So we're going to start with Sarah. Sarah, you might want to just give a capsule summary of what progressive internationalism is.
Sure. Well, I think from what I understand, the Canadian government is trying to do with the progressive trade agenda is move trade deals into an area of social policy. And I think that's always a challenge. When you try to use a trade agreement to do something other than regulate trade, I think it's always going to be a challenge with your partners. And so Canada's taken the lead on this. They did so with CETA, and in the process of kind of the final days of that negotiation and the finalization of that, Justin Trudeau stood in front of a European audience and talked about the importance of trade deals impacting the people that live in the countries that those trade deals are between. And that is important. And what you saw in the United States is that was a disconnect. And so there's a loss of support for trade agreements in the United States because people aren't feeling that the effects of the positive benefits of those trade agreements, and they feel that businesses are getting all those positive effects. So there is a challenge in this whenever you ask a trade agreement to do something that's not trade, and whether it's law enforcement pieces, whether it's social policy, and it's an easier deal when you're doing something like the deal in Europe, where you have a bunch of countries that are about the same step in economic maturity and social policy and political maturity. But when you're dealing with disparate countries, such as that exist within the TPP, it's going to be a much bigger challenge.
Nick, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. So think of it this way. Can I make a prediction?
Of course.
Okay,
especially if it involves zombies.
I would say that in 20 years, progressive trade is going to be a gimme. The problem for Canada is that when you're the first, no one else is in that frame, right? And it makes it very difficult. So, I think the challenge for the government is how can they move forward a progressive trade agenda, not just for Canada, but so that other countries can start to adopt that progressive trade agenda? Is the government willing to compromise a little bit to get a little bit of a progressive trade agenda to start a broader dialogue, or is it kind of a firm line in the sand? So, I think the challenge is that we're talking a new language and a language of the future probably for a lot of trade, but no one else is in that space. And if you're in the trade space, no offense, some of my best friends are in the trade space. They're kind of like hyper geeky rules-based people who live in the post-World War II era in terms of kind of how many trade angels can dance on the head of a pin. So to talk about progressive trade is just almost foreign. So I think the challenge is when we're first to talk about this, we're just talking a different language than many other people. But I think we're ahead of the wave on this.
Amy?
Yeah, agreed. We are ahead of the wave, and I think that's where pulling in our allies is going to be really important, right? Strength in numbers. We do need to remind ourselves of our size on the global scale, and I absolutely agree these are fantastic principles and values that we need to stick by, but if the ultimate goal is impact, we certainly need to make this a long-term strategy, rally other allies, and yes, as Sarah and Nick said, proliferate this in a broader sense. At the same time, I think timing is everything, as many of you know, in really good negotiations. it's a timing thing, and I'm looking forward to learning more about our government's timing strategy and the trade-offs. I think it's showing in our actions, and I'm getting it. But I think that's really where we're going to see success or the apparent trade-off in our timing decisions.
So I'm going to ask the panelists then your quick thing, which the audience now can vote on too. Helping, hurting. Sarah?
Oh.
I'm
I'm
forcing
not
them off the
binary,
middle
I'm
again.
sorry. I think probably, if anything, within, depending on the agreement, right? So in Europe, I think it's helpful, and with TPP, I think it's going to be a real challenge to getting to a deal.
Good answer. Nick?
Short-term hurt, long-term help.
Nice. Okay. Amy, you notice how all the panelists are trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, if the end goal is signing a trade deal, it's hurting.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is our, okay. Most of the audience, almost, 58% believe it's helping and 42% hurting. Now, how many of you are sucking up to the minister? All right. Our third question. Is it possible for Canada to protect its national interest in trade negotiations? And Amy, we're going to start with you on this one.
Yes, absolutely. It's possible. It's necessary, and I think it's expected. That's what we've elected them to do, right? And I think they're doing a great job. And I think it's also the key to the success really is defining what is a deal breaker and a nice to have. And I think that's really going to be the weaving process and the maneuvering that will continue. And I think they're doing a great job. But at the same time, now it's time to take the polls that we've taken from our people and give the guidance back and be really clear in terms of what are the parameters, right, in terms of what is included and what are the engagement guidelines, if you will, in trade. So for example, ACON, right, the deal for $1.5 billion, and a Chinese company is looking to buy it. Well, is that in our national interest? What are the guidelines for that? Or is the trade parameter that foreign investment can be only so much, right? Yes, we would love to welcome foreign investment, but buyouts, not so much. Right? So if we define national interest in terms of protecting our economy or building our economy and growing it in certain ways, I think that's where the two-way engagement, right, government and private sector is going to become really valuable.
Nick?
I think it's difficult. I think average Canadians tend to think of especially the trade relationship with the United States as a binary, relatively equal state-to-state enterprise. And what was a big eye-opener for me, I remember meeting folks in the State Department in the United States, is that I came in with that idea because that's what I learned as a kid and what I learned in school, right? There's Canada and the United States. It sounds equal. It sounds very binary. But the reality is I remember talking to someone in the State Department, and what they basically said is, hey, we're a global power. How do you fit into our strategy? So yes, we have a binary relationship with Canada, but when we're engaging with Canada, we're also thinking about Mexico at the same time, although it might not be articulated at the table. We're thinking about China. We're thinking about Europe. So just think of Canada going in thinking in a binary sense, like, hey, we have a great relationship. We're your neighbor and stuff like that. And the Americans having a different frame, because if they had the same frame as we did, the deal would be done. There would be a new NAFTA. It would be modernized. So I think it's difficult to protect our national interests because we're dealing with a global superpower that has other interests and is trying to fit us into what is important for them.
So Sarah, and these will be the wrap-up comments too, so we'll
right.
leave you to, and also the whole idea of, I think there is some confusion between national interest and Canada First too,
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of definitions of national interest, and different groups of people are going to have a different definition of what's in Canadians' national interest. So you have individuals thinking about, as a consumer, what's in your best interest as a consumer, what's in the national interest as, as an engine of economic growth, what's in the best interest of Canadian security at the end of the day. And I think Nick's really right. And, and I was smiling because that was my former employer, the U.S. State Department. And 100%, I understand that, when the United States comes to the bargaining table, the United States is thinking about what it wants. It's not thinking about what you want. And so that's going to be a challenge in any negotiation with a global economic power, not just the United States, but also China, because China's looking at what it wants out of the deal. And I think that's why sometimes for kind of a more of a medium economic power, a multilateral agreement may, in the end, work to your national interest better than a bilateral agreement. All that said, I think it's really important to go back to the different definitions of national interest and look at the different issues within that and see what is in Canada's national interest on supply management, for example, because I think you're going to have several different answers depending on who you talk to.
So now, actually, the audience gets the last word. We'll see, is it possible for Canada to protect its national interests? Yes or no? A binary question. And overwhelming, so our polarization has ended. This is a lovely way to end it. 96% said yes. So with that, thank you all for helping launch this. We're going to move back to the main stage.